Sometimes the cruelest joke becomes the greatest gift. When a father sends his paralyzed daughter away to humiliate a king, he has no idea he's about to change everything. King Kael is the most feared ruler in the land. When Lord Aldric sends his daughter Elira to the palace, everyone thinks it's a cruel insult. She can't walk, can't defend herself, can't do anything a king's bride should do. But Elira arrives with something more powerful than strength. She has wisdom, courage, and a quiet dignity that stops the entire court in their tracks. While others see weakness, the king begins to see something extraordinary. What could a paralyzed Omega possibly offer the most feared ruler in the realm? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone courtyard of Aldric Castle, where King Kael stood watching his soldiers train. At 37, he commanded respect through sheer presence, broad shoulders that had never bent in defeat, hands that had never trembled before an enemy, and eyes the color of storm clouds that could silence a room with a glance. For 15 years, he had ruled this kingdom with unwavering strength, building it into a force that neighboring realms both feared and respected. Yet as he observed the clash of steel on steel below, Kael felt the familiar weight of solitude pressing against his chest. Victory in battle came easily. Ruling through strength was second nature. But the council meetings, the diplomatic dinners, the endless parade of potential brides presented by ambitious nobles, these were battles he found himself increasingly reluctant to fight. "Your Majesty," came a voice behind him. Kael turned to see Chancellor Reeves, a thin man whose nervous energy always preceded unwelcome news. "Lord Aldric's messenger has arrived. The arrangements have been finalized." Kael's jaw tightened. Lord Aldric of Thornwick, a minor noble who had been pushing for a marriage alliance for months. The man claimed it would strengthen trade routes and secure the eastern border, but Kael suspected Aldric simply wanted to elevate his family's standing. The proposed bride was Aldric's daughter, a girl Kael had never met, whose only qualification seemed to be her noble blood. "What do we know of this daughter?" Kael asked, though he wasn't sure why he bothered. Political marriages were transactions, nothing more. Chancellor Reeves shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Your Majesty, there are certain circumstances. Lady Elira is 24 years of age, well-educated, but she—" He paused, clearly struggling with his words. "She cannot walk, my lord. A riding accident several years ago left her legs without function." Kael's eyebrows rose. In a kingdom where physical prowess determined worth, where alphas were expected to choose strong, capable omegas who could bear healthy heirs and represent the crown with grace, this was highly unusual. And Lord Aldric proposes this as a suitable match. "He claims her mind is sharp and her bloodline pure," Reeves said carefully, "though there are whispers that this arrangement serves his purposes more than ours." The king was quiet for a long moment, considering. In the courtyard below, two young soldiers were locked in combat, each trying to overpower the other through brute force alone. Neither showed much strategy or finesse, just raw determination and muscle. He had built his entire kingdom on such principles, and it had served him well. But something about this situation intrigued him in a way he couldn't quite name. "When does she arrive?" "Tomorrow morning, Your Majesty. Lord Aldric sent word that she travels with only a small retinue, her personal attendant and 2 guards. That evening, as Kael sat alone in his private study, he found himself thinking about the woman who would soon enter his court. The study was his sanctuary, lined with books on military strategy and histories of great conquests. His official seal lay on the heavy oak desk, a symbol of absolute authority that had never been questioned. Yet tonight, something felt different about the weight of it. He had ruled alone for so long that the idea of sharing decisions, of considering another person's thoughts or feelings, seemed almost foreign. His advisors gave counsel, but they told him what they thought he wanted to hear. His soldiers followed orders without question. The nobles at court respected his power, but kept their true thoughts hidden behind careful smiles and political maneuvering. What would it be like, he wondered, to have someone who could speak honestly, someone who had nothing to gain from flattery or deception? The next morning arrived grey and cool, with autumn mist clinging to the castle walls. Kael positioned himself on the great balcony overlooking the main courtyard, where arriving guests were traditionally received. He expected to see the usual procession, a decorated carriage, an impressive escort, perhaps some display meant to emphasize the family's wealth or importance. Instead, a simple covered wagon rolled through the gates, accompanied by only 2 mounted guards. The vehicle itself was well made but unadorned, the kind used for practical travel rather than ceremony. As it came to a stop, one of the guards dismounted and moved to the back of the wagon. What Kael saw next would remain etched in his memory forever. The guard lowered a wooden platform, revealing a young woman seated in what appeared to be a wheeled chair of elegant but practical design. She wore a dress of deep blue wool, simple but well-tailored, and her dark hair was arranged in a style that was proper without being elaborate. But it was her bearing that stopped Kael's breath. Despite her obvious disadvantage, despite arriving at a court where she would surely face mockery and disdain, Lady Elira sat with perfect composure. Her spine was straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap, and as she was carefully lowered to the courtyard stones, she looked around with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. The castle servants and courtiers who had gathered to witness the arrival fell silent. Some stared with open curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement. Kael heard whispered conversations starting behind him, the words "paralyzed" and "insult" drifting up from below, but Elira seemed untouched by the attention. She spoke quietly to her attendant, a middle-aged woman who pushed the wheeled chair toward the main entrance with practiced ease. There was something about the way she moved, not walking, but still moving through the world with purpose and grace that commanded a respect Kael hadn't expected. "An interesting arrival," came a voice beside him. Lord Commander Marcus, Kael's most trusted military advisor and oldest friend, had joined him on the balcony. The man's scarred face showed the same curiosity that Kael felt. "Indeed," Kael murmured. Below, Elira was being escorted inside the castle, but she had turned for one last look at the courtyard, and her eyes swept upward to the balcony where Kael stood. For a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than it actually was. Their gazes met across the distance. There was no deference in her expression, no attempt to look away or show submission, as would be expected when meeting the eyes of a king. Instead, she regarded him with frank assessment, as if she were taking his measure just as he was taking hers. When she finally looked away, it was with a slight nod. Acknowledgement between equals rather than the bow of a subject to her ruler. "She doesn't seem intimidated," Marcus observed. "No," Kael agreed, and found himself looking forward to their formal introduction in a way that surprised him. "She doesn't." That afternoon, the formal presentation took place in the throne room, with its high vaulted ceilings and tapestries, depicting the great victories of Aldric's kings. Kael sat upon the ancient stone throne that had been carved from a single block of granite, wearing the crown and ceremonial robes that emphasized his authority. The court assembled in their finest clothes, eager to witness what many assumed would be an awkward and brief encounter. When the great doors opened and Elira entered, the whispers started immediately. But as she approached the throne, moving in her chair with the same quiet dignity she had shown in the courtyard, something unexpected happened. The whispers gradually died away, replaced by a silence that held curiosity rather than mockery. She stopped at the appropriate distance and inclined her head respectfully. Not the deep bow that most supplicants offered, but a measured acknowledgement of his position. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice carried clearly through the vast room. "I am honored by your welcome to Valdris, Lady Elira," Kael replied, studying her face. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her dark eyes, the subtle strength in the set of her jaw. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "It was, thank you. Your kingdom's roads are well maintained, and your border guards were most courteous." It was a diplomatic response, but there was something in her tone that suggested she had genuinely paid attention to these details rather than offering empty pleasantries. As the formal ceremony continued, with Chancellor Reeves reading the terms of the proposed alliance, Kael found his attention repeatedly drawn to Elira's face. She listened intently to every word, occasionally asking quiet questions of her attendant. When the Chancellor mentioned trade agreements, her eyebrows rose slightly. When military cooperation was discussed, she leaned forward with obvious interest. This was not a woman who had been sent here as a passive symbol of her father's ambition. This was someone who understood the complexities of what was being negotiated. The ceremony concluded with the traditional invitation for the guest to remain at court while the terms were finalized. As the assembled nobles began to disperse, many casting curious glances at Elira, Kael made an impulsive decision. "Lady Elira," he called out, causing the room to fall silent again. "Would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner tomorrow evening? I find myself curious about your thoughts on the proposed alliance." If she was surprised by the invitation, she didn't show it. "I would be delighted, Your Majesty." As she was escorted from the throne room, Kael realized he was looking forward to tomorrow evening more than he had anticipated anything in years. For the first time since becoming king, he was about to have dinner with someone who might actually tell him what they really thought. Elira's first 3 days at Valdris Castle were a careful dance of observation and endurance. The servants were polite but distant, clearly unsure how to treat a guest who couldn't navigate stairs without assistance. The noble ladies of the court alternated between exaggerated sympathy and barely concealed disdain. The men either ignored her entirely or spoke to her with the patronizing tone one might use with a child. Through it all, Elira maintained her composure, learning the rhythms of palace life while quietly cataloguing everything she observed. The cook's schedule, the rotation of guards, the way information flowed through the servant networks, details that most nobles would consider beneath their notice, but which painted a clear picture of how the kingdom actually functioned. She had been assigned quarters in the East Wing, rooms that were comfortable but clearly chosen for their ground floor location rather than their prestige. Her attendant, Marta, had served her family for 15 years and possessed the invaluable ability to gather information while appearing to gossip aimlessly with other servants. "The kitchen staff speak highly of His Majesty," Marta reported on the third morning as she helped Elira dress. "They say he's fair with wages and doesn't tolerate cruelty toward the servants. But the nobles are another matter. Lots of scheming and positioning for influence." "What do they say about this proposed marriage?" Elira asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Most think it's some kind of jest gone too far. A few believe your father is trying to insult the king, though they can't figure out why." Lord Commander Marcus told his aide that any man who would use his daughter as a pawn deserves whatever consequences follow. Elira absorbed this information without comment. She had suspected from the beginning that her father's motivations were not as straightforward as they appeared. Lord Aldric had been distant since her accident, his shame at having a defective daughter barely concealed. But to send her here, to a court where she would face certain humiliation, that suggested something beyond mere political ambition. Her contemplation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A young page entered, bowing nervously. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but there's been a development. The king has called an emergency council meeting and—" He paused, looking confused. "He's asked for you to attend." Elira felt Marta's hands still on her hair. Emergency council meetings were attended only by the king's most trusted advisors and military commanders. For a guest, especially one in her position, to be invited was unprecedented. "Did he say why?" Elira asked. "Border scouts brought news of Theron raiders massing near Millhaven," the page said. "The council's been arguing for 2 hours about how to respond." Elira knew Millhaven, a prosperous town that controlled a crucial river crossing and 3 major trade routes. If the Therons took it, they would have a foothold in Valdris territory and access to supply lines that could support a larger invasion. "Tell His Majesty I'll attend immediately," she said. The council chamber buzzed with tense voices when Elira arrived. Maps covered the long oak table, and several of the king's advisors gestured animatedly while making their points. The conversation stopped abruptly when she entered, and she felt the weight of every stare as Marta wheeled her to an empty space along the wall. King Kael looked up from the map he'd been studying. "Lady Elira, thank you for coming. We find ourselves facing a delicate situation, and I thought an outside perspective might prove valuable." Lord Commander Marcus cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, with respect, this is a matter of military strategy, which is precisely why I want to hear different viewpoints," Kael interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Continue, Lord Trevor." An older man with greying hair and soft hands, clearly more politician than soldier, resumed his argument. "As I was saying, we must respond immediately with overwhelming force. Deploy the 3rd and 5th battalions. Crush these raiders before they can establish a foothold. Show them that Valdris will not tolerate such aggression. And leave our northern borders vulnerable to the Corvan tribes who've been testing our defenses all summer," challenged Sir Garrett, a younger knight whose armor bore the scratches of recent combat. "We can't be everywhere at once. The Corvans are barely organized bandits," Lord Trevor scoffed. "These Theron raiders are the real threat." Elira listened to the back and forth, studying the map from her position, the markers showing troop positions, the red pins indicating reported Theron sightings, the trade routes marked in blue ink. Patterns began to emerge that the arguing nobles seemed to miss. "What about negotiation?" suggested Chancellor Reeves. "Perhaps we could offer them tribute to move along." "Absolutely not," Marcus said firmly. "Pay raiders once, and every desperate group from here to the Eastern Sea will see Valdris as weak. We'd face constant demands for tribute, but if we commit our forces to Millhaven and the Corvans attack simultaneously—" Sir Garrett began. "We're not fortune-tellers," Lord Trevor snapped. "We deal with the threat in front of us." King Kael had remained silent during this exchange, his eyes moving between the map and the faces of his advisors. Finally, he looked directly at Elira. "Lady Elira, you've been studying our map quite intently. Do you have thoughts on this situation?" The room fell silent, except for the crackle of torches. Elira felt the skeptical gazes of men who had spent their lives planning military campaigns. But she had asked herself to be here for a reason. "May I approach the map, Your Majesty?" At his nod, Marta wheeled her forward. Elira studied the markings more closely, tracing connections with her finger. "The Theron raiders appeared here, here, and here," she said, pointing to the red markers. "At first glance, it looks like they're positioning to attack Millhaven from 3 directions. But look at the timing of the sightings. They're not coordinated for a simultaneous assault. They're moving in sequence, almost like—" She paused, running her finger along the blue trade route lines. "Like they want to be seen. Each sighting has occurred within sight of a major road, where merchants or travelers would spot them and spread word." "What are you suggesting?" Marcus asked, leaning forward with interest rather than skepticism. "I'm suggesting this might be a feint," Elira said. "Look at the Corvan movements in relation to Theron sightings. Every time you've pulled troops north to investigate Corvan raids, the Therons have been reported somewhere else entirely. It's as if they're coordinated." "Lord," Trevor frowned. "That's quite an accusation." "The Corvans and Therons have been enemies for generations." "Have they?" Elira asked mildly. "Or is that simply what we've always assumed?" because if I were planning to invade Valdris, I might find it useful to have my enemy thinking about two separate threats instead of recognizing one coordinated campaign. King Kael straightened, his expression sharpening. Continue. The real target isn't Millhaven, Elira said with growing confidence. It's the Ironhold mines. Look, if Corvan forces strike here while you're defending Millhaven, they'd have a clear path to the mines. Control those, and they control half your kingdom's wealth. The Theron raiders aren't positioning to attack anything. They're positioned to cut off reinforcement routes once the real assault begins. The silence stretched as everyone studied the map with new eyes. Marcus was the first to speak. By the gods, she might be right. If we send our main force to Millhaven, we'd be doing exactly what they want, Kael finished. He turned to Elira, with something like admiration. How certain are you about this assessment? I can't be certain without better intelligence, she admitted, but the patterns are there. I'd recommend sending a small force to Millhaven, enough to make it look like you're taking the bait, but keeping your main strength positioned to defend the mines. And I'd suggest getting scouts behind those Theron positions to see if they're actually preparing for battle or just trying to be visible. Lord Trevor's face had grown red during this exchange. Your Majesty, surely you're not going to base military strategy on the speculation of a... He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but the implication hung in the air. King Kael's voice went deadly quiet. On the speculation of what, Lord Trevor? I simply meant that Lady Elira, however intelligent, lacks practical military experience. As do you, Kael said bluntly. The difference is, her analysis makes sense. Lord Commander Marcus, implement Lady Elira's recommendations, split deployment, make it appear we're reinforcing Millhaven while actually strengthening the mines, and get those scouts moving. At once, Your Majesty. As the council dispersed to implement the new strategy, King Kael approached Elira's chair. Where did you learn to read military situations like that? Books, mostly, she said with a slight smile. My father has an extensive library on military history and strategy. After my accident, I had considerable time to read. And you remembered all those details about our troop positions and trade routes after seeing them once. I've found it useful to pay attention to details others might overlook, she said diplomatically. King Kael studied her face for a long moment. Indeed, Lady Elira, I believe I've been underestimating what you might contribute to this alliance. As she was wheeled from the chamber, Elira realized that something fundamental had shifted. The king was no longer looking at her as his advisor's unwelcome obligation. For the first time since arriving at Valdris, she felt like someone was actually seeing her. 3 days later, word arrived that Elira's strategic assessment had been correct. The scouts sent behind Theron positions found camps that were clearly temporary, with supply lines pointing not toward Millhaven, but toward known Corvan strongholds. More importantly, they discovered evidence of communication between the supposedly hostile tribes, message carriers, and shared supply caches that proved coordination. When Lord Commander Marcus delivered this news to the king in the presence of his senior staff, the vindication of Elira's analysis sent ripples through the court. Some nobles grudgingly acknowledged her insight, while others seemed to resent having been shown up by someone they had dismissed as inconsequential. King Kael, however, was intrigued rather than threatened. The morning after receiving Marcus's report, he sent a personal invitation for Elira to join him in the castle gardens for their postponed private dinner. The gardens of Valdris Castle were Kael's one concession to beauty over function. Designed by his grandmother decades earlier, they featured winding paths through carefully tended beds of late-blooming flowers, with several small pavilions positioned to take advantage of scenic views. It was to one of these pavilions that Elira was escorted that evening. She found King Kael waiting for her, dressed more simply than she had seen him before, fine clothes, but without the formal regalia of court. The pavilion had been set with a small table, 2 chairs, and space carefully arranged for her wheeled chair, and several oil lamps that cast warm light over the scene. "Lady Elira," he said, rising as she approached. "Thank you for joining me. I hope you don't mind dining outdoors. I find the gardens more conducive to honest conversation than the formal dining hall." "I prefer it," she said, and meant it. The evening air was cool but comfortable, and the setting felt intimate in a way that the grand spaces of the castle did not. As servants arranged their dinner, simple but excellently prepared food rather than the elaborate courses typical of state meals, Kael found himself studying his guest. Away from the political theatre of the court, Elira seemed more relaxed, though no less composed. There was something about her presence that made the space feel different, more alive somehow. "I owe you an apology," he said after the servants had withdrawn. "I invited you to court as a diplomatic courtesy, but I fear I underestimated both the challenges you would face here and the contributions you might make." Elira sipped her wine. A local vintage, she noted, rather than the imported luxuries, usually served to important guests. "You had no reason to expect anything particular from me, Your Majesty. My father's letter likely emphasized my bloodline rather than my abilities." There was something in her tone that made Kael look at her more sharply. "You speak of your father with little warmth." For a moment, Elira's composed mask slipped, revealing something that might have been pain. "Lord Aldric has made his feelings about my condition quite clear over the years. I understand his disappointment. A daughter who cannot fulfill traditional expectations is a burden rather than an asset. And yet you're here," Kael observed, "representing his interests in a potentially advantageous alliance." "I'm here because he had no other choice," Elira said quietly. "My younger sister died of fever 2 winters ago. I'm all that remains of his bloodline, imperfect though I am." The honesty of this admission surprised Kael. In his experience, nobles spent considerable effort presenting their family situations in the most flattering light possible. Their loss was considerable then, but perhaps their perspective is limited. Elira met his eyes across the table. "You're very kind, Your Majesty, but we both know the realities. A king needs a queen who can stand beside him at ceremonies, bear healthy heirs, and represent the crown with grace. I understand why this proposed arrangement might seem like mockery to your court." "Do you?" Kael leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Because I'm beginning to think the mockery might be directed elsewhere." Something in his tone made Elira's attention sharpen. "What do you mean? Your strategic analysis the other day wasn't just correct. It was brilliant. You saw patterns that experienced military minds missed, made connections that could have saved lives and territory. That's not the work of someone sent here to humiliate me. That's the work of someone with genuine skill." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Which makes me wonder if your father sent you here knowing exactly what you're capable of, and perhaps hoping I wouldn't recognize it." The possibility had occurred to Elira, but hearing it spoken aloud by the king himself sent a chill through. To what end? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Kael's expression grew thoughtful. "In the meantime, I have a request. Would you be willing to attend my council meetings regularly? Not as a guest, but as an advisor. Your perspective has already proven valuable." The offer was so unexpected that Elira sat silent for several seconds. "Your existing advisors would not welcome such an arrangement." "My existing advisors will adapt," Kael said firmly. "I'm more interested in good counsel than in preserving wounded pride." As they continued their dinner, the conversation turned to less weighty matters. Books they had read, places they hoped to travel, the challenges of leadership, whether of a kingdom or simply one's own life. Kael found himself genuinely enjoying Elira's company in a way he hadn't experienced in years. She listened thoughtfully, asked intelligent questions, and offered observations that revealed both wisdom and wit. For her part, Elira discovered that, away from the formal constraints of court, King Kael was not the intimidating figure she had expected. He was clearly intelligent and decisive, but also surprisingly self-reflective. He spoke honestly about the loneliness of leadership, the weight of making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and his growing frustration with advisors who told him what they thought he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. "Sometimes I think ruling would be easier if I could simply order people to be honest with me," he said at one point, a rueful smile crossing his face. "But then you'd never know if their honesty was genuine or simply another form of compliance." Elira replied, "True honesty can't be commanded, it has to be earned." Wise words. And how does one earn such honesty? By showing that you can handle the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. By demonstrating that you value accuracy over flattery. By proving that honest counsel is rewarded rather than punished. Kael nodded slowly. "You speak from experience." "I've learned that most people find my situation uncomfortable," Elira said matter-of-factly. "They either pretend it doesn't exist or treat it as my defining characteristic. Both responses are dishonest in their own way. The few people who simply accept it as one aspect of who I am, those are the ones worth knowing." As the evening drew to a close, Kael realized he was reluctant to see Elira return to her quarters. The conversation had been the most intellectually stimulating and emotionally honest he'd enjoyed in months. "Lady Elira," he said as servants came to clear the table, "I hope you'll consider making Valdris your home for an extended stay regardless of how the marriage negotiations conclude. Your counsel would be welcome for as long as you're willing to provide it." "That's very generous, Your Majesty. Though I suspect my father expects this arrangement to reach a swift conclusion, one way or another." Something in her tone suggested she knew more about her father's intentions than she had revealed. As Marta wheeled her away into the castle, Kael found himself looking forward to tomorrow's council meeting with anticipation rather than resignation. For the first time in his reign, he would have an advisor whose loyalty was to truth rather than personal advancement. What he didn't yet understand was how dangerous that loyalty would prove to be for both of them. Elira's integration into King Kael's council proved both smoother and more contentious than either had anticipated. Within a week, it became clear that her analytical mind was suited to far more than military strategy. When Chancellor Reeves presented a complex trade dispute between two merchant guilds, Elira quickly identified the underlying issue, a poorly written contract that left both parties vulnerable to exploitation by a third party who was deliberately fostering the conflict to drive down prices. When Lord Commander Marcus brought concerns about supply line security, Elira suggested a rotation system that would make the routes unpredictable to raiders while maintaining efficiency. When the kingdom's treasurer worried about declining tax revenues from a particular region, Elira's questions revealed that the local tax collector had been systematically underreporting collections and pocketing the difference. Each success, however, seemed to deepen the resentment of certain court members. Lord Trevor made increasingly pointed comments about outsiders influencing royal policy. Lady Cordelia, the most senior of the noble ladies at court, began organizing social events specifically designed to emphasize Elira's inability to participate in traditional court activities. Several younger nobles took to making elaborate shows of courtesy, bowing deeply and speaking loudly as if her paralysis affected her hearing as well as her legs. Through it all, Elira maintained her composure, but Kael noticed the subtle signs of strain, the way her shoulders tensed during particularly cruel displays of false sympathy, the careful neutrality of her expression when nobles made jokes about carrying one's weight or standing firm in her presence, the quiet dignity with which she endured condescension that would have provoked him to violence had it been directed at him. The situation came to a head during a formal dinner celebrating the successful resolution of the Theron Corvin threat. The joint raiding force had dissolved when their coordination was exposed, and several of their leaders had been captured in a brilliantly executed pincer movement based on Elira's strategic recommendations. It should have been an evening of triumph for her. Instead, it became an exercise in subtle cruelty. Lady Cordelia, seated at the head of the ladies' table, raised her wineglass in what appeared to be a toast. "To Lady Elira," she announced in a voice that carried throughout the hall, "who has shown us all that true nobility lies not in how we stand, but in how we think." The words were technically complimentary, but delivered with such saccharine emphasis that their barbed nature was unmistakable. Other nobles picked up the theme, offering increasingly elaborate praise for Elira's unique perspective and inspiring dedication despite her challenges. Kael watched this performance with growing anger, but also with admiration for how Elira handled it. She accepted each backhanded compliment with gracious thanks, never allowing her expression to show the hurt. He could see building behind her eyes. She was, he realized, protecting him as much as herself. Any visible distress on her part would create a scene that would reflect poorly on his judgment in elevating her position. But when Lady Cordelia suggested that perhaps they should organize a charity dance for those less fortunate in mobility, Kael's restraint snapped. "Lady Cordelia," he said, his voice cutting through the dinner conversation like a blade through silk, "perhaps you could enlighten us about your own contributions to the kingdom's welfare. I confess I'm having difficulty recalling any instances of your strategic insight proving valuable to the realm." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Cordelia's face went pale, then red. "Your Majesty, I merely thought—" "Yes," Kael continued relentlessly, "that's precisely the problem. You thought to entertain yourself at the expense of someone whose counsel has proven more valuable in a single week than yours has in years of residence at this court." He stood, commanding the attention of everyone present. Lady Elira's analysis prevented what could have been a devastating military defeat. Her insights have resolved disputes, improved our defenses, and saved the crown considerable expense. If there is anyone in this hall whose contributions to Valdris deserve celebration, it is hers. The king's words sent ripples of tension through the assembled nobles. Some looked chagrined, others defiant. Elira herself seemed torn between gratitude and concern about the political ramifications of his public defense. After the dinner concluded, Kael sought her out in the gardens where she often went to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the castle. He found her in the pavilion where they had shared their first private meal, staring out at the moonlit landscape. "You didn't need to do that," she said without turning around. "Yes, I did." He moved to stand beside her chair, close enough that she could see his expression in the lamplight. "I will not tolerate cruelty in my court, especially directed at someone who has earned respect through merit. Your defense of me will only make things worse for both of us," Elira said quietly. "They'll say you're besotted, that I've used feminine wiles to cloud your judgment. Let them say it." The intensity in his voice surprised them both. "I care more about your counsel than their gossip." Elira finally looked up at him, studying his face in the flickering light. This arrangement was supposed to be temporary, a diplomatic courtesy while marriage terms were negotiated. The arrangement has evolved. Kael moved closer, drawn by something he was only beginning to understand. "As have my feelings about it." The admission hung in the air between them, changing everything. Elira's breath caught as she recognized the meaning behind his words, the dangerous territory they were entering. "Your Majesty." "Kael," he said softly. "When we're alone like this, I'm simply Kael." "Kael," she repeated, his name sounding different in her voice than it had in anyone else's. "This is dangerous, for both of us." "I know." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her hand. "I know the complications, the political ramifications, the practical difficulties. I understand all of it. And yet I find myself thinking about you far more than is wise for a king." I value your opinion above that of advisors I've known for years. I look forward to our conversations more than any other part of my day." He paused, his thumb tracing across her knuckles. "I'm beginning to care for you in ways that have nothing to do with politics or alliances." Elira's heart raced at his confession, even as her mind catalogued all the reasons this was impossible. "My father expects an answer to his proposal soon, and we both know what that answer must be. Do we?" Kael's eyes searched her face. "Because I'm starting to think your father sent you here with very different expectations than he claimed." Before Elira could ask what he meant, footsteps approached along the garden path. They quickly separated, Kael stepping back to a respectful distance as Lord Commander Marcus appeared at the pavilion entrance. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty, but there's urgent news from the eastern border. A messenger arrived with word from Lord Aldric." Kael's expression hardened. "What does he want?" "He requests an immediate answer regarding the marriage proposal. The messenger carries authority to finalize terms tonight if you're willing to proceed, or to withdraw the offer entirely if you're not." Elira felt something cold settle in her stomach. The timing seemed deliberately calculated to force a decision before Kael could think through the implications. "Tell the messenger I'll provide an answer in the morning," Kael said. "Your Majesty, he claims Lord Aldric's instructions were specific, an answer tonight, or he returns empty-handed." Kael's jaw tightened with anger. "Then he can explain to Lord Aldric that kings are not subject to ultimatums from minor nobles." After Marcus departed to deliver this message, the moment of intimacy between Kael and Elira had passed, replaced by the weight of political reality. "He's forcing your hand," Elira observed. "Yes, the question is why." Kael studied her face in the lamplight. "Elira, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, always. What do you think your father hopes to gain from this arrangement? Because I'm becoming convinced that neither of us understands his true motives." Elira was quiet for a long moment, considering everything she had observed and suspected since arriving at Valdris. "I think," she said slowly, "that he sent me here expecting you to reject the proposal quickly and publicly. The humiliation would justify whatever he planned to do next. And now that I haven't rejected it, now he's trapped in a situation he didn't anticipate, with a daughter who has proven unexpectedly useful to his supposed enemy." She met his eyes. "Kael, I think my father may have been planning something more than a simple political alliance. And I think my presence here has complicated his plans considerably. The realization that they might both be pawns in a larger game, one neither of them fully understood yet, should have been frightening. Instead, Kael found it oddly liberating. Then perhaps it's time we stopped playing by his rules," he said. The War Council chamber had never seen discussions quite like the ones that followed Elira's integration into King Kael's inner circle. The ancient oak table, carved from a single massive tree and worn smooth by generations of strategic planning, now bore maps and documents that reflected a fundamentally different approach to governance. Where previous councils had focused primarily on military strength and territorial control, Elira brought perspectives that encompassed trade relationships, resource management, and the complex web of alliances that truly determined a kingdom's stability. Her presence had transformed not just the content of their discussions, but the very nature of how decisions were made. The Merchants Guild is requesting permission to establish a permanent trade post in Riverdale, Chancellor Reeves announced during a particularly complex morning session. They claim it will increase tax revenue and provide employment for the local population. Traditionally, such requests were evaluated based on immediate financial benefit and political advantage, but Elira had taught them to look deeper. "What are the secondary effects?" Kael asked. A question that would have seemed irrelevant months earlier. Elira studied the proposal documents. Riverdale is currently supplied by 3 smaller merchant families who have operated there for generations. A permanent guild post would likely drive them out of business within 2 years. "So," Lord Trevor interjected, If the guild is more efficient, then you'll have 3 families with no livelihood, likely forced to migrate to other regions, where they may not find work, Elira continued patiently. But more importantly, you'll have replaced local merchants who have personal stakes in the community's welfare with guild representatives whose primary loyalty is to profit margins. She traced her finger along the map. Riverdale sits on a crucial supply route. If relations with the guild sour in the future, they could simply close their post and leave the entire region without reliable trade access. The local merchants, however, would never abandon their home community. Lord Commander Marcus leaned forward with interest. So you recommend rejecting the guild's request? I recommend negotiating a partnership instead, Elira said. Require the guild to work through existing local merchants rather than replacing them. The guild gets their trade post, the local families maintain their livelihoods, and the crown ensures continued stability regardless of future political changes. It was exactly the kind of solution that had made Elira invaluable to Kael's administration. Practical, forward-thinking, and considerate of consequences that others missed. But it was also the kind of innovation that increasingly frustrated nobles who preferred the straightforward certainties of traditional power structures. After the council session concluded, Kael found himself walking through the castle corridors with Elira, discussing the day's decisions. It had become their custom, these informal conversations where they could explore ideas without the political constraints of formal meetings. You realize you're revolutionizing how we govern, he told her, as they paused near a window overlooking the castle courtyard. I'm simply asking questions that apparently haven't been asked before, Elira replied, though I'm beginning to understand why. What do you mean? The kind of analysis I provide requires admitting that simple solutions are rarely adequate for complex problems. That means acknowledging uncertainty, considering multiple perspectives, and accepting that the best answer might require compromise. She gave him a wry smile. Those aren't qualities traditionally associated with strong leadership. Kael was quiet for a moment, watching servants and guards move about their duties in the courtyard below. My father ruled through certainty, he said eventually. Every decision was final, every judgment absolute. His advisors learned to present options in terms of clear victories or defeats, and that approach served the kingdom well for many years, Elira observed diplomatically. But the world has become more complicated since his time. The threats we face now, economic manipulation, coordinated raids by supposedly hostile tribes, trade wars that can be as devastating as military ones, they require different kinds of responses. They require rulers willing to admit when they don't have all the answers, Elira agreed, and advisors brave enough to provide uncomfortable truths rather than comfortable lies. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Cordelia, who approached with the kind of deliberately gracious smile that immediately put both of them on guard. Your Majesty, Lady Elira, she said with a curtsy that managed to seem both respectful and condescending. I hope I'm not intruding on affairs of state. Not at all, Lady Cordelia. Did you need something? Actually, I wanted to speak with Lady Elira about the upcoming harvest festival. We've been planning the traditional celebrations, and I thought perhaps she might have suggestions for accommodating various needs. The careful phrasing didn't disguise the underlying message. Elira had been at court long enough to recognize when she was being reminded of her limitations. I appreciate your consideration, Elira said calmly, though I suspect the traditional celebrations will be perfectly adequate for everyone. Oh, but surely there are aspects of the festival that might prove challenging? The dancing, for instance, or the ceremonial procession through the castle grounds. Kael's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Elira placed a gentle hand on his arm, a gesture so brief and subtle that Lady Cordelia almost missed it. Lady Cordelia raises an interesting point about the festival planning, Elira said thoughtfully. I've been reviewing the historical records of past celebrations, and I notice that accessibility has occasionally been an issue for elderly nobles as well. Perhaps this year would be an excellent opportunity to consider modifications that would allow all members of the court to participate fully. The suggestion neatly turned Lady Cordelia's implied criticism into a broader discussion of inclusive planning, while simultaneously pointing out that Elira's situation was hardly unique. Several of the older lords and ladies at court had mobility issues that were typically ignored rather than addressed. "That's very thoughtful," Lady Cordelia said, clearly having not anticipated this response. "I'll be happy to work with the Festival Planning Committee to develop suggestions," Elira continued graciously. "After all, celebrations should bring the community together rather than exclude anyone." After Lady Cordelia departed, looking somewhat deflated by the conversation's outcome, Kael turned to Elira with admiration. "That was brilliantly handled." "She wasn't entirely wrong," Elira said. "There will be aspects of the festival that I cannot participate in traditionally, but that doesn't mean I should be excluded entirely, or that the solution is to simply ignore the issue." "No," Kael agreed. "It means finding better solutions than we've used before." As they resumed their walk through the castle, Kael found himself thinking about the harvest festival in ways he never had previously. The celebration had always been a display of royal power and noble privilege, elaborate ceremonies that emphasized hierarchy and tradition. But what if it could be something more? What if it could actually bring the community together, as Elira suggested? "Elira," he said suddenly, "what if we made some changes to this year's festival? Not just accommodations, but actual improvements to how we celebrate. What did you have in mind? I'm not sure yet, but I'm thinking about what you said, bringing people together rather than emphasizing divisions. What would a festival look like if it were designed around that principle?" Elira's eyes lit up with interest. "It would be quite different from traditional royal celebrations." "Good," Kael said firmly. "I think it's time for some new traditions." Neither of them realized that their conversation had been overheard, or that plans were already being made to ensure that any new traditions would be short-lived. The document that would change everything began as a simple diplomatic correspondence. Elira had spent the morning in the castle's archives, researching historical trade agreements to support a proposal for new commercial partnerships with the Eastern Kingdoms. The work was meticulous but satisfying, exactly the kind of detailed analysis that had proven her worth to King Kael's administration. She was cross-referencing a particularly complex treaty when Marta hurried into the archive chamber, her usually calm demeanor showing signs of distress. "My lady, there's been a development," the older woman said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I was speaking with the kitchen servants, and they mentioned something strange. A messenger arrived this morning from your father's estate. Not an official courier, but one of his personal guards, traveling in common clothes." Elira looked up from her documents, immediately alert. "Did he seek an audience with the king?" "No. That's what's odd. He went directly to Lord Trevor's quarters, stayed for less than an hour, then departed by a back gate. Very secretive, very unusual for normal diplomatic correspondence." The implications sent a chill through Elira. Lord Trevor had been one of the most vocal critics of her influence on the king's decisions, and his resentment had only grown as her position became more established. Did anyone overhear their conversation? The guard who escorted him said they spoke too quietly to make out words, but Lord Trevor seemed very pleased about whatever news he received. He sent messages to several other nobles immediately afterward. Elira set down her quill, her mind racing through possibilities. None of them were reassuring. That evening, she requested a private meeting with King Kael in his study. She found him reviewing reports from regional governors, his expression troubled by what he was reading. "These harvest projections are concerning," he said by way of greeting. 3 provinces are reporting significant crop shortfalls, but the numbers don't align with the weather reports we've received. Kael, Elira said, her serious tone immediately capturing his attention. We need to discuss my father's true intentions. He set aside his reports and gave her his full attention. What have you learned? She related Marta's observations about the secret messenger and Lord Trevor's suspicious behavior. As she spoke, Kael's expression grew increasingly grim. How long has it been since your father sent his original proposal? He asked. Nearly 2 months. And in that time, you've proven invaluable to my administration, gained the respect of my closest advisors, and demonstrated capabilities that far exceed what his letter suggested. Kael rose from behind his desk and began pacing. If his goal was simple political advancement through marriage, he would be celebrating your success. Instead, he's sending secret messages to my harshest critics at court, Elira finished, which suggests his original plan required your failure, not your success. They were both quiet for a moment, considering the implications. Finally, Elira spoke the thought they were both having. He sent me here expecting you to reject me quickly and publicly. The humiliation would justify breaking the alliance, possibly even claiming insult to his family honor, leaving him free to ally with my enemies, Kael said grimly. The question is, with whom? Before Elira could respond, a knock came at the study door. Lord Commander Marcus entered at Kael's call, his expression urgent. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but I have news that can't wait. Our spies in the Eastern Kingdoms report unusual troop movements near the border. King Aldric's forces, along with contingents from at least 2 other minor nobles, appear to be massing for some kind of joint operation. Kael's face went pale. How large a force? Significant enough to threaten our eastern provinces if they coordinate properly. But here's what's most concerning. The timing suggests they've been planning this for months. Elira felt the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. This was never about a marriage alliance, she said quietly. It was about creating a pretext for war. What do you mean? Marcus asked. My father sends his paralyzed daughter to the most powerful alpha king in the region, expecting her to be rejected with disgust. He then claims the king insulted his family and his bloodline. Justification for rallying other nobles who resent Valdris's power into a coordinated attack. Kael's hands clenched into fists. Except you weren't rejected. You became indispensable to my administration instead, which ruined his timeline and his justification, Elira continued. So now he's trying to salvage the plan through court intrigue. Turn my supporters against me, undermine my position, create the scandal he needs to justify his actions. Marcus looked between them, understanding dawning in his expression. The secret messenger to Lord Trevor was probably carrying instructions on how to accomplish exactly that, Kael finished. The 3 of them stood in silence, absorbing the full scope of the betrayal. Lord Aldric hadn't just risked his daughter's happiness for political advantage. He had actively planned to sacrifice her reputation and safety for his ambitions. There's something else, Elira said, her voice barely above a whisper. If this has been planned for months, other nobles at court may already be involved. The resistance to my presence, the social pressure, the attempts to undermine my credibility, some of it may have been coordinated from the beginning. You're saying we don't know who we can trust, Kael said. I'm saying we need to assume that anyone who has shown particular hostility to me might be working with my father's plans. Marcus began mentally cataloguing nobles whose behavior suddenly seemed more sinister in light of this revelation. Lord Trevor, obviously. Lady Cordelia has been leading the social campaign against Lady Elira. Sir Garrett has been questioning your military decisions more frequently. Enough, Kael interrupted. We can't afford paranoia, but we also can't afford naivety. Marcus, I want increased security around Lady Elira immediately. and I want intelligence gathered on anyone who's been in communication with Lord Aldric's people. At once, Your Majesty. After Marcus departed, Kael turned to Elira with an expression that mixed anger, concern, and something deeper. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "No one should have to discover that their own father views them as expendable. I've known for years that he saw me as a burden," Elira replied, though her voice carried pain despite her composed exterior. "I just didn't realize he would go this far to be rid of that burden." Kael moved closer to her chair, close enough to take her hands in his. "Elira, I need you to know that whatever games your father is playing, whatever plots he's hatched, none of it changes how I see you. None of it diminishes what you mean to me." She looked up into his eyes and saw not pity or political calculation, but genuine caring that took her breath away. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Kael said firmly, "we turn his plan against him. If Lord Aldric wants to play games with our lives, he's about to learn that some opponents are more dangerous than he anticipated." For the first time since Marta had brought news of the secret messenger, Elira smiled. It was not a pleasant expression, but it was full of determination. "I think it's time my father learned what his defective daughter is truly capable of accomplishing." Shu, Harvest Festival of Valdris, had never been more magnificent. King Kael and Elira's collaborative planning had transformed the traditional celebration into something unprecedented. A 3-day festival that genuinely brought together nobles, merchants, craftsmen, and common folk in shared celebration. The Great Hall had been reconfigured to accommodate guests of all physical capabilities. The courtyards featured exhibitions of local crafts and skills, and the evening entertainments included poetry, music, and storytelling alongside the customary dancing. Even Elira's harshest critics had to admit the festival was a remarkable success. The modifications she had suggested didn't diminish the grandeur of the celebration. They enhanced it, creating an atmosphere of genuine community joy rather than mere aristocratic display. Merchants reported unprecedented sales, visiting dignitaries, praised the innovation, and the common people spoke of feeling truly honored by their king's attention. It was during the festival's second evening, as the great hall buzzed with conversation and celebration, that the poisoned chalice made its appearance. The evening's centerpiece was a formal toast to the harvest and to the alliances that protected the kingdom's prosperity. King Kael stood before the assembled guests, resplendent in ceremonial robes, holding high a golden chalice that had been used for such occasions for generations. "To Valdris," he declared, his voice carrying across the hall, "and to all who contribute to our shared prosperity." The response thundered back from hundreds of voices, "To Valdris." As tradition dictated, the king drank first from the ceremonial chalice before it was passed among the highest-ranking nobles present. When it reached Elira, positioned at the high table in the place of honor that had become hers by right of service to the crown, she accepted it with the same grace she had shown throughout the evening. The wine was excellent, a vintage from the royal cellars, rich and complex. But as Elira raised the chalice to her lips, she noticed something that made her pause. The rim bore a faint residue that seemed darker than wine should leave, and there was an almost imperceptible bitter scent beneath the grape sweetness. In that frozen moment, every conversation she'd had with Marta about palace security came rushing back. Every warning about the dangers faced by those who gained unexpected influence, every discussion about how easily a seemingly loyal servant could be bought or coerced. Elira's hand trembled slightly as she lowered the chalice without drinking, her mind racing through implications. If someone had poisoned the wine, they had done so with full knowledge that the cup would come to her after being tested by the king's own consumption. Either the poison was designed to affect only her, or— "Lady Elira," King Kael's voice cut through her panicked thoughts. He had noticed her hesitation, and concern was evident in his expression. "Is something wrong?" The entire hall was watching now, hundreds of eyes focused on her unusual behavior. Protocol demanded that she drink and pass the chalice along. Refusing would create a scene that would overshadow the entire festival. Instead, she made a decision that would change everything. "Your Majesty," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall, "I believe there may be something in the wine that shouldn't be there." The silence that followed was absolute. Then came the immediate buzz of shocked conversation. As guests processed what she had just suggested, Kael moved swiftly to her side, taking the chalice from her hands and examining it closely. His expression darkened as he detected the same signs she had noticed. "Lord Commander Marcus," he called out, his voice cutting through the growing tumult. "Clear the hall, now." What followed was controlled chaos as guards moved to secure the great hall while guests were escorted out in groups. Some nobles protested the disruption, others whispered excitedly about the drama, but most simply obeyed the king's obvious urgency. Within minutes, only Kael's most trusted advisors remained, along with Elira and a handful of guards. The festive atmosphere had been replaced by something far more sinister. "Have this analyzed immediately," Kael ordered, handing the chalice to Marcus, "and find out who had access to it between the time it was filled and when it reached this table." As guards hurried to execute his commands, Kael turned his full attention to Elira. "How did you know?" "The smell was wrong, and there was residue on the rim that didn't match the wine," she explained, though her voice shook slightly with delayed shock. "Someone wanted me to drink from that specific cup." "Or," Chancellor Reeves said grimly, "they wanted both of you to drink from it and miscalculated the dosage or timing." The investigation that followed moved with ruthless efficiency. Within 2 hours, they had identified the poison, a rare substance that would have appeared to cause heart failure, particularly believable in someone with Elira's physical limitations. The wine had been doctored after the chalice was filled. But before the ceremony began, and the servant responsible had disappeared from the castle entirely. But the most shocking revelation came when guards searching the missing servant's quarters found a sealed letter bearing Lord Aldric's personal seal. Kael read the letter in the presence of his inner circle, his expression growing more thunderous with each line. "Marcus," he said finally, his voice deadly quiet, "send word to our spies in the eastern kingdoms. I want to know the exact location and strength of every force allied with Lord Aldric, and I want that information within 24 hours. "Your Majesty," Chancellor Reeves said carefully, "what did the letter contain?" Kael looked at Elira before answering, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been murder. Instructions for the servant to ensure that Lady Elira did not survive the festival, he said, along with detailed plans for Lord Aldric to arrive within days of her death, claiming that his daughter had been murdered by enemies of their alliance and demanding immediate vengeance against those responsible. The full scope of Lord Aldric's betrayal settled over them like a shroud. He hadn't just been willing to sacrifice his daughter for political gain. He had actively planned her assassination and intended to use her death as justification for war against the kingdom that had given her sanctuary. "There's more," Kael continued grimly. "The letter references other nobles at court who were expected to support his claims and rally to his cause once the tragedy occurred. Lord Trevor, Sir Garrett, Lady Cordelia, all of them have apparently been in communication with him for weeks." Elira felt a strange calm descend over her, replacing the shock and fear with something harder and more determined. "He never intended for me to return home alive," she said quietly. "No," Kael confirmed, moving to kneel beside her chair so they were at eye level. "But Elira, you saved yourself tonight. Your awareness, your intelligence, they prevented not just your own death, but likely a war that would have cost thousands of lives. What happens now?" Before Kael could answer, Marcus returned with urgent news. "Your Majesty, Lord Aldric's forces are already moving. Our spies report that he broke camp 2 days ago and is advancing toward our border with a significant army. He's clearly not waiting for news of the assassination's success. Then he's committed treason against the crown, Kael said, rising to his full height, and he's about to learn the consequences of threatening what I hold dear. The king's words carried implications that went far beyond political alliances, and everyone present understood that the nature of his relationship with Elira had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a valuable advisor or an advantageous marriage prospect. She had become something precious to him, something worth fighting for. "Elira," he said, turning back to her with an expression that mixed tenderness with steel. "Your father sent you here as a pawn in his political games. He expected you to be rejected, humiliated, and ultimately sacrificed for his ambitions. Instead," she replied, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes, "I became something he never anticipated. Yes, you became the woman I intend to marry, not for politics or alliances, but because I cannot imagine ruling this kingdom without you beside me." His voice carried across the room with absolute certainty. "And now, your father is about to discover just how dangerous it is to threaten a queen." The chalice that had nearly killed her sat on the table between them, its gold surface reflecting the torchlight like a warning. But Elira no longer saw it as a symbol of her near death. Instead, she saw it as the catalyst that had finally revealed the true nature of the game being played around them. Now, at last, they could stop being pawns and start being players. The ancient crown of Aldric had rested in its ceremonial case for nearly a century, removed only for coronations and the most sacred state occasions. Forged from gold mined in the kingdom's own mountains and set with gems that had been gifts from allied realms, it represented not just royal authority, but the accumulated wisdom and responsibility of generations. King Kael stood before the crown, now in the pre-dawn darkness of his private chambers, studying its intricate engravings by candlelight. Each symbol told a story: conquests won, alliances forged, crises weathered by rulers who had faced impossible choices and somehow found ways to protect their people. Soon, he would face his own impossible choice. "The modifications you requested have been completed, Your Majesty," came a quiet voice behind him. Master Thorn, the kingdom's most skilled goldsmith, had worked through the night to fulfill Kael's unusual commission, though I confess, I've never been asked to alter a crown before. Kael examined the craftsman's work with approval. The crown remained unmistakably royal, but now it bore a second, smaller circle of gold that could be worn alongside the main crown, a symbol of shared rule rather than solitary authority. "It's imperfect," he said. "Thank you." As the goldsmith departed, Kael's thoughts turned to the woman who had inspired this unprecedented modification. Elira had spent the hours since the poisoning attempt in what she called strategic preparation, analyzing intelligence reports, mapping supply lines, and developing contingency plans with the focused intensity that had first caught his attention. She refused to be relegated to safety while others prepared for war, and Kael had learned better than to argue with her when she applied that particular tone of polite determination. Instead, he had ensured that the castle's most secure chamber was converted into a command center where she could coordinate defensive strategies without being exposed to direct attack. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called. Lord, Commander Marcus stepped into the chamber, his expression grim with the weight of unwelcome news. "Your Majesty, the final scout reports have arrived. Lord Aldric's forces are larger than we initially estimated, nearly 3,000 men, including cavalry and siege equipment. Our strength? 2,000 regular soldiers, plus another 500 castle guards and militia. We're outnumbered, but we have the advantage of prepared defenses and interior supply lines." Kael nodded, having expected numbers along these lines. "And the traitors within our court? Detained as you ordered. Lord Trevor, Sir Garrett, Lady Cordelia, and 6 others are being held in the castle's lower chambers. Their communications with Lord Aldric have been documented, and we found evidence of planning for a coordinated uprising once news of Lady Elira's death reached them. The scope of the conspiracy still amazed Kael. Nearly a dozen nobles had been prepared to betray their oaths of loyalty, gambling that Lord Aldric's victory would elevate their positions in a new regime. How long before Aldric's forces reach our gates? By noon tomorrow, assuming they maintain their current pace. Less than 18 hours to prepare for a siege that would determine not just the fate of his kingdom, but the future he hoped to build with the woman he loved. "Send word to our allies," Kael commanded. "King Harold of the northern provinces, Duke William of the coastal territories, Lord Commander Eric of the mountain clans. Tell them Valdris calls for aid under the ancient pacts." "Already done, Your Majesty. But even if they respond immediately, relief forces cannot reach us for at least 3 days. 3 days. Kael and his people would need to hold the castle for 3 days against superior numbers, led by a man who had demonstrated his willingness to murder his own daughter to achieve his ambitions. There is one other matter," Marcus continued hesitantly. "Lady Elira has requested a private audience with you. She says she has a proposal that could change our tactical situation significantly." Kael found Elira in the converted command center, surrounded by maps and documents that painted a comprehensive picture of their strategic position. She had been working for hours, her attention focused with the same intensity she brought to all complex problems. "You sent for me," he said, taking a seat across from her at the planning table. "I've been analyzing our defensive capabilities against Aldric's likely attack patterns," she said without preamble, "and I believe we're approaching this incorrectly." "How so?" Elira moved several markers on the tactical map. "We're thinking like victims, preparing to endure a siege until help arrives. But my father chose this approach because he believes we'll react defensively, allowing him to control the timing and terms of engagement." "You're suggesting we take the initiative instead?" "I'm suggesting we make him react to us for once." Her eyes met his across the map. "Kael, I know something about my father that could prove decisive, something that could turn his greatest strength into his greatest weakness." She paused, and he could see the internal struggle in her expression, the difficulty of using intimate knowledge against family, even family that had betrayed her. "My father's greatest fear has always been appearing weak or foolish in front of other nobles," she continued quietly. "It's why he was so ashamed of my condition, why he's gone to such lengths to orchestrate this conflict. His entire alliance is built on the premise that he's been insulted and must restore his honor, and if that premise were shown to be false, if his allied nobles realized they'd been manipulated into supporting an unprovoked attack on a kingdom that had shown his daughter nothing but respect and honor." She let the implication hang in the air. Kael leaned forward, beginning to understand. "You want to turn his own allies against him. I want to offer them the truth before the battle begins. Let them see the evidence of his conspiracy, the assassination plot, the betrayal of his own daughter. Give them a chance to withdraw with honor before they're committed to a war based on lies." It was a dangerous gamble. Revealing their knowledge of the conspiracy would eliminate any advantage of surprise, but it might also prevent unnecessary bloodshed by undermining Aldric's coalition. "Some will stay loyal to him regardless," Kael pointed out. "Yes, but others came here because they believed he had been wronged. If we can show them the truth, that he orchestrated this entire conflict, that he tried to murder his own daughter, to justify it, some will refuse to continue supporting him." Kael studied the map, considering the implications. It would require sending envoys to his camp under a flag of truce. "Dangerous and no guarantee of success. There's more," Elira continued. "I believe we can do better than simply presenting evidence. I want to offer them something my father cannot, genuine partnership rather than dominance." "What do you mean?" "The minor nobles who joined his coalition did so partly because they feel excluded from real power. They see larger kingdoms like Valdris as threats to their independence. But what if we offered them trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, cultural exchanges, real benefits that would make them stronger rather than simply absorbed into someone else's ambitions? The audacity of the proposal took Kael's breath away. In the midst of preparing for a siege, she was suggesting they attempt to forge lasting peace by addressing the underlying causes of conflict. "Elira," he said carefully, "you're talking about revolutionizing the entire relationship between Valdris and its neighbors. I'm talking about building something better than what we've had before, something worth fighting for, but hopefully something that won't require fighting to maintain." Before he could respond, urgent voices echoed from the corridor outside. Marcus burst into the chamber moments later, his expression tense with new developments. "Your Majesty, there's been a change. Lord Aldric has sent an envoy requesting immediate negotiations. He's offering to withdraw his forces in exchange for Lady Elira's return to his custody and formal acknowledgement that he was justified in questioning the alliance terms." The audacity of the demand rendered them temporarily speechless. After attempting to have his daughter assassinated, Aldric was now claiming he simply wanted her back safely. "He's trying to salvage the situation," Elira observed with cold clarity. "The assassination failed, so now he needs a different justification for his military mobilization. If he can claim he was simply a concerned father protecting his daughter from an unsuitable arrangement, some of his allies might accept that explanation." "Over my dead body," Kael said flatly. "That may be exactly what he's hoping for," she replied. "If you refuse his reasonable request, he can claim you're holding his daughter against her will. That gives him moral justification for the attack. In the eyes of his coalition." Marcus looked between them, waiting for instructions. "What do we tell his envoy?" Kael rose from the table, his decision crystallizing. "Tell him I'll respond to his proposal personally. At dawn, I'll meet with his full leadership under flag of truce at the neutral ground between our positions." "Kael, that's incredibly dangerous," Elira protested. "He's already tried to kill me. He won't hesitate to arrange an accident during negotiations if it serves his purposes. Then it's fortunate I won't be going alone." He moved to stand beside her chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Lord Aldric wants his daughter back. Then he can explain to his allies exactly why she refuses to return to him." The implications of his words sent a thrill of both fear and anticipation through. "Elira, you're suggesting I accompany you to the negotiations. I'm suggesting we call his bluff completely. You'll attend as my betrothed, wearing the crown of a queen-to-be, with full documentation of his conspiracy available for his allies to examine. Let them see for themselves what kind of man they've been following." It was the kind of bold stroke that could either end the crisis before it began or escalate it into something far worse. But as Elira looked at the tactical map spread before them, she realized it was also their best chance of achieving something more than mere military victory. "There's one condition," she said. "If we're going to do this, we do it right. Full. A formal presentation with all the evidence properly documented and witnessed. We don't just accuse my father, we prove his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt." "Agreed. Marcus, send word accepting the meeting and requesting that all coalition leaders attend. Dawn at the stone bridge over Miller's Creek. And if Lord Aldric refuses the expanded meeting," Kael's smile was sharp as a blade, "then his allies will know he has something to hide." As preparations began for what might be the most important negotiation in Valdris's history, Elira found herself thinking about the crown Kael had shown her earlier. 2 circles of gold designed to be worn together, a symbol of partnership rather than hierarchy. Tomorrow she would wear that crown to face the father who had tried to have her killed, and she would do so not as his victim or his pawn, but as the future queen of a kingdom that had seen her true worth. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, it filled her with a calm determination that surprised her with its strength. "Lord," Aldric had taught her that sometimes the cruelest joke could become the greatest gift. Tomorrow, she would teach him that sometimes the daughter he had tried to discard could become his greatest enemy. Dawn came grey and cold to the stone bridge. Over Miller's Creek, the ancient crossing that had served as neutral ground for negotiations between kingdoms for over 2 centuries. Mist rose from the water below, creating an ethereal backdrop for what would prove to be one of the most consequential meetings in the region's history. King Kael arrived with a small but impressive retinue: Lord Commander Marcus, Chancellor, Reeves, and a dozen of his most trusted knights, bearing the battle standard that Elira had designed. The flag caught the morning breeze, its gold and blue fabric displaying the intertwined symbols of strength and wisdom that had come to represent their partnership. But it was Elira's presence that commanded attention from the moment she appeared. Seated in a specially crafted chair that gleamed with silver inlay and precious stones, wearing robes of deep purple silk that marked her as royalty to be, she bore the smaller crown that Kael had commissioned, a delicate but unmistakable symbol of her status as future queen. Her bearing was regal, in a way that had nothing to do with physical stature and everything to do with the quiet confidence that had first caught Kael's attention months earlier. Lord Aldric's contingent approached from the opposite direction, and Elira felt her breath catch as she saw her father for the first time since leaving his estate. He rode at the head of his column, still imposing at 55, his greying beard and weathered face giving him the appearance of a seasoned military leader. Behind him came the coalition of nobles who had agreed to support his cause, men whose faces she recognized from years of political gatherings. The two groups met at the center of the bridge, where a simple wooden table had been placed for the negotiations. As was traditional, weapons were set aside, though the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. "Your Majesty," Lord Aldric said, dismounting and offering a bow that was technically correct, but carried undertones of mockery. "I appreciate your willingness to discuss this matter reasonably, Lord Aldric," Kael replied formally, his voice carrying no warmth whatsoever. "I confess myself curious about your definition of reasonable behavior." Aldric's eyes moved to his daughter, and Elira saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, perhaps, at her transformed appearance, or possibly annoyance that she looked every inch a queen, rather than the humiliated burden he had expected. "Elira," he said, his tone attempting paternal concern, "I trust you've been treated well during your stay at Valdris. Though I must say, the reports I've received about your situation have been concerning." "What reports?" she asked calmly, though every instinct warned her this was the beginning of his prepared justification. "That you've been used as a political tool, paraded before the court for entertainment, subjected to mockery and ridicule by those who see your condition as amusing." His voice carried just enough genuine emotion to be convincing to those who didn't know better. A father cannot stand by and watch his daughter suffer such treatment. Several of the coalition nobles nodded sympathetically, clearly having heard some version of this story during their journey to Valdris. It was cleverly done, a narrative that cast Aldric as a protective father and Kael as a cruel king who had mistreated a defenseless woman. "Is that truly what you believe has happened here?" Elira asked, her voice carrying across the bridge with crystal clarity. "I know what my sources have reported," Aldric replied smoothly, "and while I'm sure King Kael meant no deliberate harm, the reality is that this arrangement has not served anyone's interests well." "You're quite right," Elira said, and for a moment Aldric looked pleased at her apparent agreement. "This arrangement has indeed revealed things that serve no one's interests. Lord Commander Marcus, would you please present the documents we discussed?" Marcus stepped forward, carrying a leather case that he placed on the negotiating table. "Lords and gentlemen, what you're about to see is evidence of a conspiracy that has endangered not just Lady Elira's life, but the stability of this entire region. As Marcus began laying out documents, copies of the poisoning letter, records of secret communications, testimony from captured conspirators, Elira watched her father's face carefully. She saw the moment when he realized that his careful plans had been not just discovered, but documented in detail. "These are forgeries," he said quickly, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The handwriting has been verified by 3 independent experts," Chancellor Reeves said mildly. "The seal impressions match samples from your official correspondence. The paper and ink are consistent with materials used in your personal household." One of the coalition leaders, Lord Garrett of the Eastern Marches, leaned forward to examine the evidence more closely. "Aldric," he said slowly, "this letter appears to instruct someone to poison your own daughter." "Preposterous. I would never—" "You would never what?" Elira interrupted, her voice carrying a steel that silenced the bridge completely. "Murder your own daughter to justify a war? Use her death as a rallying cry to unite ambitious nobles against a kingdom that had shown her nothing but respect?" She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes fixed on her father's face. "Or did you mean you would never get caught?" The accusation hung in the morning air like the mist rising from the creek below, and Elira could see the coalition leaders exchanging glances of growing suspicion and doubt. The silence that followed Elira's accusation stretched until it became almost unbearable. Lord Aldric's face had gone pale, then flushed red with what might have been anger or shame. Around the negotiating table, his allies were studying the evidence with expressions that ranged from shock to disgust. Lord Garrett was the first to speak, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Aldric, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't bring us here to support a war based on murdering your own child." "The documents are fabricated," Aldric insisted, but his protestations sounded hollow even to himself. "King Kael has clearly orchestrated this entire presentation to avoid taking responsibility for his mistreatment of my daughter." "What mistreatment?" demanded Lady Catherine of Riverside, one of the few female nobles in the coalition. "Because from where I stand, your daughter appears to be wearing a crown and speaking as an equal partner in these negotiations. That hardly suggests abuse." Elira rose from her chair, not standing, but commanding attention through sheer force of presence. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority that had made her invaluable to Kael's council. "Lords and ladies of the Eastern Coalition," she said formally, "I stand before you not as my father's pawn or as King Kael's victim, but as a woman who has found her true worth in a place that valued her mind above her limitations." She gestured to the battle standard that flew behind Kael's retinue. "That flag bears symbols I designed, representations of strength and wisdom working in partnership rather than competition. It flies because King Kael recognized that true power comes from combining different kinds of strength, not from dismissing what appears weak." Her eyes moved deliberately to each coalition leader as she continued. "My father sent me to Valdris, expecting me to fail, to be rejected and humiliated so thoroughly that my disgrace would justify whatever actions he chose to take. Instead, I found a king who listened to my counsel, advisors who valued my insights, and a court that learned to judge me by my contributions rather than my appearance." "Pretty words," Aldric interjected desperately, "but they don't change the fact that this entire arrangement was designed to mock our family and our bloodline." "You're right," Elira said quietly, and the admission sent ripples of surprise through both groups. "This arrangement was designed to mock someone. The question is whom?" She pulled out a final document, one that made Aldric's face go white as he recognized the handwriting. "This is a letter my father wrote to me 3 days before I departed. For Valdris," she announced. "In it he expresses his hope that King Kael will quickly dispose of the embarrassment I have become and rid our house of its shameful burden. He goes on to suggest that my death in a foreign court would be no great losses and might even provide useful political opportunities." The effect on the coalition leaders was immediate and devastating. Lord Garrett actually stepped back from Aldric as if physical distance could separate him from association with such callousness. Lady Catherine's expression showed undisguised revulsion. "You planned her death from the beginning," she said accusingly. "I never," Aldric began. "You wrote those words," Elira interrupted, her voice cutting through his denials, "in your own hand, with your own seal, just as you wrote the instructions for my assassination, just as you coordinated with traitors in King Kael's court to create the chaos you needed to justify your attack." Lord Garrett threw down the document he had been examining. "This is unconscionable, Aldric. I came here because you claimed your daughter had been insulted and mistreated. You asked me to risk my men's lives to restore your family's honor." "Honor?" Lady Catherine spat. "What honor is there in sacrificing your own child for political gain?" The coalition was fracturing before Aldric's eyes, and his desperate attempts to regain control only made things worse. "You don't understand the larger picture," he insisted. "Valdris grows too powerful, threatens the independence of all our smaller kingdoms. Sometimes sacrifices must be made." "Not of innocent daughters," Lord Garrett said flatly, "and not based on lies and murder plots." King Kael, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally stepped forward. "Lord Aldric, you have a choice to make. Withdraw your forces, dissolve this coalition, and return to your lands in disgrace. Or proceed with your attack and face not just my armies, but the knowledge that half your supporters have already abandoned you." Aldric looked around the bridge at faces that had been friendly that morning, and now showed only contempt or pity. His carefully constructed alliance was collapsing, his justifications exposed as lies, his reputation destroyed by his own daughter's words. But rather than surrender, something desperate and dangerous flickered in his eyes. "You think you've won," he said, his hand moving toward the ceremonial sword he still wore, despite the truce negotiations. "You think exposing my plans makes you safe, but I've come too far to let my worthless daughter—" He never finished the sentence. Lord Commander Marcus's blade was at his throat before he could draw his own weapon, and the coalition leaders who remained had drawn back in horror at this final revelation of his character. "Stand down, my lord," Marcus said quietly. "Your war is over." 3 months after the confrontation at Miller's Creek, the great hall of Valdris Castle had been transformed once again, not for a harvest festival this time, but for a royal wedding that would be remembered for generations, as the day tradition gave way to something entirely new. The wedding rings that symbolized the union between King Kael and Queen Elira were not the elaborate ceremonial bands typical of royal marriages. Instead, they were simple circles of gold, elegant in their unadorned beauty, engraved on the inside with words that only the couple would see. Strength in wisdom, wisdom in strength. The ceremony itself reflected the same principles that had guided their partnership from the beginning. Rather than the traditional format where the bride was presented to her husband as a gift from her family, Elira and Kael stood as equals, making vows of mutual support and shared responsibility. The modified crown she wore complemented rather than competed with his own, and when they turned to face their assembled guests as husband and wife, it was clear that Valdris had gained not just a queen, but a new model of leadership entirely. The aftermath of Lord Aldric's failed conspiracy had sent shockwaves throughout the region. His own coalition had dissolved within hours of the bridge confrontation, with former allies publicly denouncing his actions and several offering formal apologies to both Kael and Elira. The man himself had been taken into custody, where he awaited trial for treason, attempted murder, and conspiracy against the crown. But perhaps more significantly, the revelation of his plot had created an opportunity for genuine diplomatic progress. The same nobles who had been prepared to march against Valdris out of fear and resentment now found themselves invited to participate in something unprecedented, a regional alliance based on mutual benefit rather than dominance and submission. The Eastern Accord, as historians would later name it, established trade partnerships, mutual defense agreements, and cultural exchange programs that strengthened all participating kingdoms while preserving their individual autonomy. It was exactly the kind of innovation that had made Elira invaluable to Kael's administration, applied now to the broader challenge of regional stability. Lord Garrett of the Eastern Marches, who had been among the first to abandon Aldric's coalition, once the truth was revealed, spoke for many of his peers when he formally signed the Accord documents. "We came here prepared for war because we feared being absorbed into something larger than ourselves. Instead, we've been offered the chance to become part of something better than any of us could build alone." The wedding feast that evening was a celebration not just of the royal couple's union, but of the new diplomatic relationships that had emerged from the crisis. Representatives from kingdoms throughout the region raised toasts to peace, prosperity, and the wisdom of leaders who chose partnership over conquest. As the festivities continued into the night, Kael and Elira found themselves in a quiet moment, together on the same garden pavilion, where their relationship had first deepened from professional respect into something more personal. "Do you regret any of it?" Kael asked, taking her hand in his as they watched the celebrations continuing in the castle courtyard below. "The assassination attempt? The confrontation with my father? The complete transformation of everything I thought my life would be?" Elira smiled, her expression mixing contentment with lingering wonder at how dramatically her circumstances had changed. "No, I don't regret any of it. Not even the pain of learning what your father truly thought of you?" The question touched on wounds that were still healing, but Elira had spent considerable time working through the emotional aftermath of her father's betrayal with the castle's wise woman and her own inner resources. "I regret that he couldn't see what I was capable of accomplishing," she said thoughtfully. "I regret that his shame and ambition blinded him to the possibility that his defective daughter might have value beyond what he could imagine. But I don't regret learning the truth, because it freed me to build something better than what he would have allowed." She gestured toward the courtyard, where nobles from half a dozen kingdoms were sharing food and conversation, their previous hostilities replaced by genuine cooperation. "A year ago, I was hidden away in my father's estate, considered a burden and an embarrassment. Tonight, I'm the Queen of Valdris and a partner in creating peace across the Eastern Kingdoms. If that's not proof that the cruelest joke can become the greatest gift, I don't know what is." Kael brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. "You realize you've revolutionized more than just our marriage customs. The other kingdoms are starting to pay attention to advisors they might have overlooked before. People whose contributions were dismissed because they didn't fit traditional expectations of power." "Good," Elira said firmly. "There's too much wisdom in the world to waste it because it comes in unexpected packages." A messenger approached the pavilion, bowing respectfully before delivering news that brought their romantic interlude to a close, but filled them both with satisfaction. "Your Majesties, word has arrived from the northern provinces. King Harold has formally requested assistance in establishing a council similar to yours, one that values diverse perspectives and innovative solutions over traditional hierarchies." It was exactly the kind of influence they had hoped their example might have, proof that the changes they had brought to Valdris could inspire similar improvements elsewhere. As they returned to their wedding celebration, walking side by side, through gardens illuminated by hundreds of lanterns, Elira reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. She had arrived at Valdris as an unwanted pawn in her father's political games, expected to fail and be discarded. Instead, she had found her true strength, a love that valued her completely, and a role in shaping a better future for countless people throughout the region. The wooden chair she had arrived in, simple, practical, unadorned, now rested in a place of honor in the castle's great hall, bearing a plaque that read, "True nobility lies not in how we stand, but in how we rise." To meet life's challenges, it would remain there for centuries, a reminder to future generations that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest gifts arrive disguised as the cruelest jokes. In the end, Lord Aldric had been right about one thing. His paralyzed daughter had indeed changed everything, just not in the way he had planned.